Welcome to the next edition of Will's Way. You join me here on Bungalow Lake at Gold Valley. It's a much smaller lake, about the smallest lake we've got on site, and it's much more intimate and a little bit more realistic to what a lot of people fish as we go into the winter. Today I'm not targeting anything in particular, carp, silvers, whatever comes along, but what I want to show you is how I go about catching big fish and a mixture of fish on light line. For me, it's very important as you go into the winter, the colour drops out the water, the fish become hard to catch, and the one advantage that I always like to use is fishing very light, 010, 011 lines. I do like the fluorocarbon lines again because, you know, they're very, very hard to see in water, but fishing light for me is an absolute must. Okay, there's situations still next to reed beds, lily pads, overhanging trees where you can't do it. But these small intimate little lakes with quite a few fishing light when it goes cold will definitely get you more bites. Obviously then you've got to look at playing them correctly with the right elastic and balanced tackle and just taking your time. These are all things I want to try and show you in this edition of Will's Way. So now I want to show you the rigs and the bait that I've bought for today's session. Bearing in mind, I've already said I'm not targeting silvers or carp, I'm just targeting bites. It's been quite a cold morning, the leaves are coming down, it's that time of year where I just want to get bites and then take my chance on the size of the fish. So the rigs that I've assembled for today's session, I'm going to fish 3 lines. Now I just want to talk briefly before I show you the rigs about my thinking about fishing left and right, or 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock as a lot of people call it. I quite often advise people not to do that. I advise them to fish dead in front of you, 1 line. And the reason for this is quite simple. A lot of the venues I fish are very big, quite deep. And if you encounter any tows starting mid-match, you will want to be fishing downstream. Obviously on these smaller, more intimate lakes, the tow and the movement of the water isn't really a factor. So I am a fan on these smaller, more intimate lakes of fishing 2 lines. I'll go into the bait in a little bit, but I want to show you the rigs first off. I'm going to be throwing some casters and a little tiny bit of wet ground bait on a top 5. So I've put up a nice 4x14s Darwa carper commercial float, just strung out number 9s, looking to catch anything. I might catch some roach, might catch some skimmers, might even catch a carp or even an F1. I'm not really that bothered, I just want to get bites. You can see the float there, nice and sensitive, and quite a short line to yellow hydro. Again, nice and soft, balanced. The main line is 016 Darwa Tournament, and the hook length is 011/7 Darwa Tournament fluorocarbon to a size 18 LWG. And again, this is on the heavy side of how I like to fish this time of year. Just thinking that on that top 5 line, there's a chance of not many bites, but maybe some real big fish. So 012 is the sort of line that I want to start on there. Going on to the long line, I've already plumbed up 10 o'clock and, like I say, 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock should I say, and luckily it's the same depth. If you encounter a peg that isn't, always make sure that you put up the rigs to suit. Don't just make do, as 2 or 3 inches here and there can make a massive difference. And basically for this line, I've put up 2 rigs, one with a bulk and 2 droppers, just my bulk standard dead maggot rig, again 016 mainline. This time 010 hook length, again to a size 18 LWG. Nice and light just to get some bites. The float, slightly thicker top and in a 4x16. Absolutely love these floats, the Darwa Carper commercial range. A slightly longer line. Again, we're going into winter. I want to flick my rig out. You'll notice as well, no back shots. I don't want my float being dragged in under my pole tip. I want to be able to fish past my bait and on the outskirts, flicking my rig around. It's a beautiful day, there's no wind. We're not going to have trouble in controlling the float. So a slightly longer line. Again, yellow hydro. I can play the fish for a long time and just get everything in, whether it's a 2-ounce roach or a 10-pound carp. Again, they're set 1.5 inches over depth. And again, the last rig for today's session, not that one, that's not got one on, is a pellet rig. Again, 016 mainline, 0.10 hook length. I'm looking to catch skimmers, bream, and maybe even an odd carp. Exactly the same float as on the Balkan 2 dropper, 4B16s, and exactly the same length line. Even though I'm on pellets, when the water's cold, clear, and the fish are on the back foot, you can catch them just swinging your rig out a little bit. And again, yellow hydro. You'll notice on all the rigs I've got the same elastic, and for me that is vitally important. Getting at home with an elastic, getting to know your elastic, exactly how hard you can pull, especially when you're looking to fish light lines like we are today. 012 being heavy, but mainly 010 and an 18 hook. The bait for today's session, like I say, I'm going to put a pellet line in to the left. I've got some expanders, just some nice 4mm. I've got some soaked fishery pellet micros. I've got a little bit of ground bait. I've mixed some green bream up, but this is more for the left hand line. I'm going to put some soft ground bait in, almost loose, with some dead maggots in over to my right. Got the dead maggots there. Again, another thing a lot of people ask me is the best way to kill dead maggots. Obviously not kill dead maggots, but kill live maggots. But there are a multitude of ways, but I hear it all the time. I've put them in water, I've bagged them up, and after 10 minutes, they've all come round. Maggots are very, very, very hard to kill. The best way to do it is to put them in a nice bag a week before, put them in your fridge, absolutely airtight, and that way it just ensures that they don't come round. I've already said on that top 5 line, I'm going to loose feed a few casters. Again, I'm not just targeting carp. If I was just targeting carp, it would probably be corn, hard pellets. But today, I'm going to show you exactly how I go about just catching a few fish on these cold, hard days. So some nice casters there, and I've got a few worms. Just for the hook, I can put a little tiny P bit on if I'm catching an odd roach or an odd skimmer. That works really well on a lot of venues. Tiny, tiny bits of worms. And I've got a little bit of ground bait there that I've just mixed up that I'm going to introduce to begin with on that top 5. And I'm just going to put a tiny bit in. There's some chopped worm in there. It's the green bream ground bait with a few casters. Again, I'm just going to feed my lines and just see what happens, just trying to get bites. So like I say, they're the rigs, that's the bait. One or two other little things that is absolutely massive when you're fishing like this: far bank markers. I know a lot of people do, but you have to pick far bank markers, something that's not going to move like a car or an angler. Pick a peg, something that isn't going to move, so you know exactly where you are, where you've plumbed up, where you've fed, and where you want to fish. It's very easy if you don't do this to actually lose control of where you fed. Was it that tree? Was it this bush? No, it was that peg, or that silver birch and that peg. Absolutely important to have real, defined far bank markers. Accuracy is a massive, massive part of all my fishing, and this time of year it's no different. Far bank marker will give me accuracy this way, and fishing to the end of the section will give me accuracy this way. Very important when you want to fish on your bait, but also very important, you'll hear me talk a lot today about flicking my rig past, fishing on the outskirts. And if you know exactly where you've plumbed up, exactly where you've put your bait, it's very, very easy to fish just past it and even just on it. Again, I'm going to be looking for little signs. If there is an odd carp about, they're going to blow. It's quite a soft bottom here, especially where I'm going to put some pellets in. Like I said, the other side of my peg, I'm going to put in some loosish ground bait with some dead maggots. It's quite a soft bottom. I don't want to squeeze big hard balls. I just want it to go down and almost just coat that bottom, because I know it is quite soft. I can feel it with the plummet. But normally when it's cold, where the bottom's a little bit soft, you can catch a few fish. So they're the rigs for today's session. You've seen the bait. Got a little bit of an array of bait, but I'm just covering myself because I don't know what it's going to be like. The roach might feed, the skimmers might feed, or it could be carp. But one thing's for sure, I'm almost certain by fishing light, nice, small, delicate floats, light line, light elastic, we're definitely going to get a few bites. Right, well, I'm going to start the session. Like I said, on that top 5 line, I'm just going to put in one small ball with a little bit of chopped worm and a few casters. Again, I'm not just targeting carp, but it's going into winter when carp and the bigger silvers definitely like a few natural baits. I'm going to put a handful of casters in there, maybe not even a handful, I just want to set that line up, and I want to start on that line just while I let my others settle. Always remembering end of the section, far bank marker. Somebody's put a nice red traffic cone on the peg opposite, which is perfect. Tap that in. Now what I'm going to do is feed my pellet line. I'm not going to go mad. I'm literally going to put in around about 100 mil of micros, and I'm going to spread it out. Again, it's a very soft bottom here, and I don't want to put, you know, a real concentrated ball in. So I'm just going to put that in, and I'm going to put in about 15 expanders as well. At Gold Valley, it's not fishery pellets only, so you can feed a few expanders. And again, I'm just taking my time. It's cold, the water's clear. The last thing you want to do is spill bait and deposit bait in an area peg where you don't want to fish because you've been rushing when cupping. Again, I can feel to the end of the section. I'm in line with the right hand side of that platform, and I'm just going to sprinkle that bait, create a little bit of an area, again on that soft bottom. Nice. Now from a ground bait line, what I'm going to show you is something that I do a lot, but a lot of anglers keep quite quiet on these soft bottoms, and that's putting your ground bait in loose. I'm not going to squeeze it into a ball. Like I say, on these shallower, more intimate, smaller venues, I'm a fan of doing it. Say for instance we were on Syndicate or Gold Lake and there was a big wind blowing, then obviously I'd be wanting to put it in balls, making sure that it's not going to go out my peg and create a massive area. And it's quite simple. Just over wet your ground bait. Like I said, this is the green bream, one of my favourite ground baits all year round, but even especially as we go into the colder months. And it's got that, it's not sloppy, but if I added a bit more water, that's what it would go to. And I've just got a few dead red maggots in there. And all I'm going to do is put my pot in and just compress it down a tiny bit. And I'm going to put 2 potfuls of this in. And again, I'm taking my time. I'm not rushing. Especially with a pot full of bait, the last thing you want to do is deposit that in an area of your peg where you don't want it and you're not going to fish. So again, over there's a nice gap in the rushes. Again, to the end of the section. And there, just turn it over and just let it out. A lot of people just don't have confidence feeding ground bait like this, but trust me, it goes to the bottom and it creates that nice carpet of bait, especially on these soft bottoms. When you plumb up here, you can almost drop your plummet in and feel the mud. Again, 2 250ml pots is quite a bit, but I've fed very negative on 2 other lines. And what this enables me to do is just bounce off one to the other, and then I can just draw some conclusions as to what I think's right. And then I can just alter my other pegs to suit. So all I'm going to do now, I've dropped that bait in short. I've got my 2 other pegs fed. I'm quite happy. They're a nice distance apart. Always have your 2 pegs, you know, like 4 to 5 meters apart if you can. It's nothing worse than having them too close and it sort of just splits your fish completely. So like I say, I'm really happy. I've got 2 real prominent markers. I've put a little bit of bait in short, and all I'm going to do is just throw some casters over that line. Maybe I won't catch there, maybe I'll catch some fish late. It's one of those, you're going into the time of year where you can't really tell what's going to happen. So covering your options is a brilliant, brilliant way of fishing. And all I'm going to do on that, oh, chicken on my side tray. All I'm going to do on that strung out rig, I'm going to start on a very, very small piece of a worm. And again, one brilliant tip I can give you. When people say to you, these top anglers, oh, I fished a tiny bit of a worm, they mean tiny. And trust me, when I show you, I mean that big. We used to call it a pea when we were, people like Des and that were in the Dorking team. tiny, tiny bit of a worm. Very, very similar to the ones that you're chopping up and feeding. And all I'm going to do is just flick my rig out and hold it right over that bait. Again, I'm in line with my marker to the end of the section. Again, I'm just going to loose feed some casters around the float. Not too many past my float. An odd one, but I want my hook bait to be one of the furthest ones out. Again, I'm not just targeting carp, I'm targeting silvers, anything that swims on this line. A real good way of fishing, because if it is a carp day or a silverfish day, I've covered every eventuality. Another fish there. Again, so I'm only on light main line. You see two things straight away. I brought the pole in as quickly as I can, and I'm just keeping that tip in the water. Massive, massive edge as well this, because if you suffer a lost fish or you get broke and your tip's in the water, your rig isn't going to be destroyed. Very, very important. And if the fish goes, that one just took off then. One other thing you want to do when you're fishing with these light lines is always have your pole at the ready. You can see here at any time, if I want to, I can just add sections. Very, very important. If that fish decides to go, I can just literally put my top 5 on. I've got the rest of my pole and I can follow that fish out. And all I'm doing is, just through experience of fishing with this yellow hydro, is I'm pulling as hard as I dare on this 012. Nice little carp to begin with. No, big F1. Brilliant. Absolutely love worms, these fish. And again, you can see I'm not bullying them, but I'm playing them with a bit of authority. And bearing in mind we're only on 012 fluorocarbon, for me, it's about just building up confidence and getting happy with how hard you can pull. And it's very important, and the best tip I can give you is just to use the same elastics, nice and soft, and that way, whether you're fishing long, short, 010, 012, you know how hard you can pull. If you start using all different elastics, it's very, very hard. Look at that for an F1, what a start. Brilliant. Nice chunky F1. And like I say, you can see that hooked absolutely plumb. Beautiful fish to start off with. And I think that just goes to show, going into this time of year, for me, I know how good pellets are. That's why I fed a line. I know how good corn and baits like this are, but I also know how good natural baits are this time of year. Maggots, worms, casters. And like I say, ignore them at your peril. Got a nice strung out rig. Nothing too positive. I can catch little fish on the drop. I can catch fish on the bottom. Just absolutely love fishing like this, because you just feel like, yes, you have to be careful playing the fish. Another fish there now. But the difference is when you can fish light, balanced tackle, in my opinion, you get a bite from virtually every feeding fish in your peg. When you start fishing heavy line, it's a skimmer, nice, beautiful. And this is the thing, you catch every single fish that's in your peg. And if you can incorporate fishing light into your armoury, exactly what I just said, you get bites. And I feel you catch everything that comes in your peg, or you hook everything that comes in your peg. You know, you can sometimes get broke on 016, 018. And sometimes you get broke on this, but I just feel like when it's cold, clear, going into this time of year, fishing light, every single fish that comes in my peg, I'm gonna hook. And that to me is an absolutely massive edge. One really important thing when you're fishing on this short line, because most of the time on this top 5 line you're going to be on a slight shelf, and that's to flick your rig out, and that way it just lays on that shelf really nice. Try not to drop it straight back down, and if you do miss a bite like I did then, I can just literally lay it back in and I know that it's coming in against that shelf. All the time I'm just offering it up against my marker, making sure I'm in the exact place where not only I plumbed up, but obviously where I've fed. Vitally, vitally important. An odd fish there. I've had a couple of tiny, tiny little roach, but we've had a couple of decent fish as well, so just being patient. Again, I'm not getting carried away thinking I've got to catch hundreds of pounds of fish. This time of year, like I said, a lot of venues the weight's full. It's just about catching a few fish. Don't expect this short line to last all day. Like I say, we've caught a nice F1, a skimmer, and a couple of little fish. And it's a real good place just to start. I'm a massive fan as well in my match fishing of just starting short and just see what happens. The advantage you've got in a match is you can look around and see what other people are doing, if they're catching, if they're not catching, what they're doing. And it gives you a brilliant sort of heads up on what your next move will be without really sort of trying. If there's a guy catching on pellets or ground bait or this, that and the other, you know where you're... There's a bite then. Tiny little indication. Just flicking that rig out. It's coming in against that shelf. Tiny, tiny little indication. But again, on that 012 and an 18 hook, absolutely. Like I said, and I do repeat myself on these days a little bit, but I just feel that every single fish that comes in my peg, I catch. And that to me is the beauty of fishing with light line. Balanced tackle, balanced elastic. Another thing I like about fishing with those small bits of worm, don't always have to change them. That was absolutely spot on again. And again, if it looks right, it's not going to have a lot of movement in it just because of the size. I can go straight back in. Like I said in the intro, there's times and places when you cannot fish light. You have to fish geared up. Like I say, if you're trying to pull them away from rush beds or lily pads or an overhanging tree. But trust me, when you're faced with an open water swim, you'll be amazed what size fish you can land, and also just how many more bites you get. Another tiny little indication then. Oof. And I think it just goes to show, and you know, it's the reason I like fishing like this. You know, we've not been fishing long and we've had 2 F1s, a skimmer and 2 little roach. So I'm not being over selective. I'm not turning my nose up at the silverfish. I'm just trying to get bites and feeding in a way where I know I'm just going to put some fish in the net, no matter what's feeding. And it's a brilliant, brilliant way to start your match. Nothing worse, we've all had it. You know, you fish very positive with big baits, and after 2 hours you've had nothing. It's just nice in a match just to get some fish in the net and just fishing in a way where you don't feel like you're missing out. I think that's the best way to put it. When I fish like this, I don't feel like I'm missing out on fish. If we were just loose feeding 6mm hard pellets there and, you know, just targeting proper big fish, I just sit there sometimes, again on these mixed fisheries, thinking, I've just missed out. I'm missing out on too many other fish. Obviously it's a bit different in the summer, but this time of year, for me, it's just about catching everything that comes in your swim. One thing as well, it's okay fishing light, it's okay fishing balanced tackle, it's okay knowing how to play them. This time of year, one of the most important things is fishing with your float dotted down. And when I say dotted, I mean literally just a pimple. Because again, some of the bites you're going to get off these big fish, you know, not just the small fish, but some of the bites you'll get off these big fish, it'll just be a tiny little dink where they're coming in and, you know, they're just picking up bits of bait, and your float almost just wobbles and dinks, and you strike and there's one on. And that last F1 that we caught was very, very similar. Just a tiny, tiny little dink almost, but it was too sharp to be a liner. Try and ignore anything slow, but anything that's fast, no matter what kind of movement, I'll tend to strike at. I mentioned earlier that it's a soft bottom on the long pole, and already where we just put those few micros, I've seen 2 or 3 bubbles come up, so I don't think it'll be long and I can have a little look out there. I'll probably put a tiny little ball in here, just keep everything cooking, keep everything turning over. And that's what a lot of these good anglers do. They've always got somewhere to go. They're not completely committing to one line, doing one thing. If that doesn't work, they've got somewhere else. And if those two don't work, they can go back to them, but they've got somewhere else to go. And that's exactly what I've tried to create today. A couple of different approaches, just depending on what works out best, but I've covered my options. And it's a real nice way to fish this time of year. Well, we've had a nice start short, but it's definitely dried up a little bit. And what I'm going to do now is just have a little look on my pellet line. And again, just see what happens. There's not so many bubbles. There's definitely a few bubbles over where I fed my loose ground bait. So again, to the end of the section, in line with my marker. There we go, float dotted down nicely. It's just about being patient now, but I spoke earlier about having your float dotted down, and what's good when you start fishing like this is it's not just the bites that you hit, it's the indications that you see. And for me, when it's cold, one of the most important things is determining if there's fish on my line or not. Now that might not always be bites, it might be little indications, a little lift on the float, it could be anything. If I've got a lot of float showing, not only am I not going to see those little bites, but I'm not going to see the little indications that give me the sort of heads up to stay on a line. And again, that to me is very important. So no matter what I'm doing, I tend to like to fish with a float that's dotted down properly. It's only been in there probably a minute and a half, but I've had no indications. What's noticeable is where I've put my ground bait, there's definitely a few more indications. And where we've just put a few micros, there doesn't seem to be that many. And when we caught those few fish early, straight away short, we put a little nugget of ground bait in. So already I'm starting to think, right, is ground bait what they want? Is that what's going to bring them into my swim? And what's nice about starting off with not a lot of bait, you can alter it as the day goes on. When you find out maybe they want this, maybe they want that, you can just alter it. And it's a very nice way of fishing when you don't feel you've overcommitted on bait or lines. You can then just change what you're doing. And one thing I'm doing now is I'm just plumbing up again, because like I said to you at the start, it's a very, very soft bottom. And when I put my float in then, it was sitting really, really low, even though I want it. And what's happened is they've definitely just dug that bottom out. So all I'm doing is just replumbing. And it's amazing, you get some decent fish in your peg, how they can just bore that bottom out. I'm not a massive fan of plumbing up during a match once I've fed, but always bear in mind when you're on these softer bottoms and your float's just sitting that little bit lower, just take your time just to plumb up again, because even, like I say, in these colder months, one carp on its own, or one decent fish, can just bore that bottom out. And if you're not presenting properly, you're not fishing that inch over depth, you're not going to get bites. Just for the sake of half a minute, just plumb up and back in. But already there's just not the amount of indications on this line as, when I mean indications, I don't just mean on the float, I mean bubbles. And already I'm starting to draw conclusions that, you know, maybe they want that little bit of bait today, a little bit more regular. And likewise, you know, in the winter, if I put a negative line in and a positive line, sometimes you'll go on your positive line, there's nothing there, but you catch on your negative line, and that's always just giving you information of what the fish want and what they're responding to. And very, very important for budding match anglers to get on that wavelength and start understanding your fishing and your feeding like that. That in mind, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give it another minute or two, and then I'm going to feed this line again just with a few micros and an odd expander, and then I'm going to try that ground bait line where there definitely seems to be a bit more activity. Just be nice and patient, because any second that float can just register the bite. And I do think that little bit of bait, I think it's been eaten and they've moved off. And again, match fishing for me, when you're talking about, you know, figuring out how to feed it, the more lines you've got to bounce off and draw conclusions from, the easier it is to come up with the winning formula, so to speak. So again, just a few micros and about 10 expanders. And you can see now in this session, you know, we've caught a few fish and it's all nice, but I've always got somewhere to go. And that to me is what all these good anglers do, you know. They've always got a line to go on where they've maybe experimented or tried something or fed it slightly different. And that to me is of utmost importance. So I'm going on the line where we fed ground bait and dead maggots. I'm going to start with 2 dead red maggots. I've gone on the other rig, which is the bulk, and 2 droppers. Again, in line with my other marker, there's a little gap in the rushes there to the end of the section. And it's a good hour and a half since we fed that line, but incorporating the tips that I've given you with far bank markers, fishing to the end of a section, you're fishing very accurately, and you're fishing over right where you've plumbed up, right where you've put your bait. Again, soft bottom, there's definitely been a few bubbles there. I'm just going to take the opportunity just to plumb up and make sure again you can see it's unbelievable, but it's a very, very important part of match fishing to be clued up when you're fishing on these softer bottoms. Otherwise you can spend large parts of the match fishing at completely the wrong depth. I'm going to keep a few casters going in short, again just in case we need to return to that line. There we go, that ground bait line not produced any carp, but we've hooked a skimmer. Brilliant. Not the biggest fish of the day by a long way, but it's all about covering your options and keeping fish coming. The one thing that I've learned is, you know, there's nothing worse than being quite, I don't know what the best terminology is, but I'd say quite sort of stubborn and almost lazy in a match as to I'm going to do this and this, and not covering your options and it costing you. And I've had that when I was younger, and it's something I go out of my way now to make sure that even if I think I don't think that'll work today, I'm going to put a rig up. If it's a possibility, I want to cover it. And also, when you've got 2 or 3 lines to bounce off, a lot of match fishing is about just keep putting fish in the net. Bungalow Lake today, it's a classic mixed fishery. There's some carp, there's some skimmers, there's some F1s, there's some tench, there's some roach, a bit of everything. And I would expect a match on here today to be one with anything from 60 to 80 pound. And like I say, just by going through the motions, topping up lines, keeping things coming and reacting to what's happening. I think that's a real important thing in the winter. You put some bait in and then you have to react. Is it very bad? Have I got to leave it longer? Be patient. Or is it very good like today? It's much, much better than I thought it might be. And it's a case of having to top up more regular, especially on the pellet line. The ground bait line, not so much. But again, I've fed that really to try and catch some skimmers. Covering my options. The pellet line goes a bit funny, I can go there. I'm still throwing a few casters short, just keeping that topped up, and I can always fall back on that line, but I've always got somewhere to go. And it's a massive, massive part of match fishing. And it's the good anglers that you'll see, they'll have 3, 4, 5 lines fed. Even on these smaller, more intimate lakes. Tiny, tiny little indication then. Thought that was going to go. Keep looking over to my pellet line. If it was a match now, I'd probably be really persevering on my pellet line, because even though we've caught some nice fish over that ground bait, it's not been as productive as the pellet line. And I think that goes hand in hand with it being slightly better than I assumed it was going to be. It's been a very cold night, a lot of rain, and I just really thought that the fishing would be on the back foot, but they've had a bit of a go today, which I'm not complaining at. But again, it's the beauty is the way we've gone about it today. We can adjust each swim. You know, I could always, if pellets didn't produce, I could put some maggots on that line if maggots were producing on my ground bait line, and just bounce off, and I can just alternate, and I can alter each line to what's happening in the match, the information that my pegs are giving me, my float's giving me. And like I say, it's just a case of being prepared to cover your options, fish light, fish dotted down. And I think if you incorporate that into your fishing, you're going to catch a lot more. I certainly do. Little indication again then. I think what I'm going to do is top that ground bait line up. Not with ground bait, just with some live maggots. Just see if I can concentrate, because there's definitely an odd fish there. But as good as that ground bait is loose when it's hard, when it's good, it's not the best, if you know what I mean. It's more of an attack for when it's very, very difficult, just odd fish about. There you go, another fish, small skimmer. Oh no, just come off. Vladimir Von popped off. Yeah, so what I'm going to do now is just feed just a few maggots and just try to create that little hot zone. Probably about 80 mil of maggots, something like that. While I'm shipping out, I'm looking over at my pellet line. Just see a little bubble there then. Nice. Really feel like we're keeping odd fish coming by bouncing off of lines, which is a way that I just love to fish this time of year. Again, just scouring my peg for any kind of... Yeah, there's definitely a fish there. Two little tiny bubbles came up there, and it's where the bottoms are soft, they sort of give themselves away. They can be tricky to catch sometimes when they start fizzing and blowing. You can quite often foul hook a few, but that's just the nature of the game, fishing on these soft bottoms. So get it in position, bang in line with my marker, right where we fed. It's amazing when you think sometimes, you know, we've hooked a few skimmers on that right hand line and no carp, and yet where we've put micros and an odd expander, we've just hooked carp and F1s and no skimmers. And those skimmers sometimes, they absolutely love pellets, but just think that these carp bully them out. It's not fizzing, but there's just odd bubbles which give you the feeling that there's definitely a fish there. I'm going to give it another minute. If I don't get an indication, I'm definitely going to feed just a few, because they seem to be coming to them quite quick now. One thing that some people are probably thinking, and again, this is the way that I think, why haven't you got a kinder pot on? If they're coming to bait regular, why haven't you got a kinder pot on? And the reason is quite simple. Even though I'm feeding quite regular, what I don't want to do when the water's cold, clear, and I don't need to catch a massive weight, is go straight in as soon as I've fed. You imagine if I had a kinder pot on, I'd tap some pellets in, lift my rig up, and I'm fishing virtually as those pellets hit the bottom. I think in clear water, when it's cold, and those fish are on the back foot, if you feed with your normal pot, just that minute of coming in, baiting up, shipping back out, just gives that little bit of time just for those fish to settle. And quite often, if you start kindering aggressive, you can get in problems with them, obviously foul hooking them, and it's something I don't want to do. You're always going to lose some, you're always going to foul hook some, but if you can keep it to a minimum, especially when weights are low, then I think you're on to a winner. Where I've potted them maggots in now, there's bubbles. So what I'm going to do is feed this line quite aggressively, and I'm going to have a quick look. And this is what quite often happens, the later in the match you go, is the fish will be more and more aggressive. We all know the end of the matches can be really, really good. And pleasure sessions are quite often very, very similar. Bearing that in mind, I'm going to put a little bit more bait in on that pellet line than we have been doing. Nice. And then straight back in on that ground bait line. And just see, I didn't put loads of maggots in, probably about 80 mil. But something's definitely a couple of little indications. Nothing short, sharp, quick indications that I really want to strike at. That was. Much, much quicker indication, that one. Even though the float's dotted down to a pimple, it was a much more deliberate, fast indication, which is exactly what you're looking for. And if I had a lot more float showing, I don't think you'd have even seen it. 2 or 3 real slow indications, and then it's just whack, gone. Whether it would have been enough to pull a full bristle under, though, I doubt it very much. And I guarantee you, not just the fishing light, not just the light elastic, not just dotting your float down, not just covering your options, but put it all together in these cold winter months, and it will make a massive difference. In match fishing now, there's not one thing on its own that makes a massive difference. What it is, it's a combination of 4, 5, 6, 7 little things all put together that do make a massive difference. Just keep me pole nice and low. It's a bit bigger than I thought. Thought it was a little F1, but it's a nice mirror. Elastic all over the place. Caught round my leg. But the most important thing is the fish is in the net. Nice fish, and just see, just by keeping that pole tip low, keeping everything down, it's come off in the net, which isn't a bad thing. Keeping everything down, everything low, you can coax those fish into netting range really, really quickly. There's another fish, and just alternating. We just caught a carp on the maggot line, topped that up, saw some fishing on the pellet line. We've gone in, hooked a carp immediately, or a big F1, I'm not too sure. And again, that light elastic, everything's just working in harmony. Just taking my time. The one thing as well, when you fish like this, it's one of those afterwards, you're like, when you pull your net out, you're like, wow, where did they all come from? Nice F1. Where did they all come from? Because you caught steady and you caught consistently. Beautiful F1. Right in the lip. There you go. Fantastic. And I'm sure if you incorporate all the little things I've shown you today into your fishing, like I say, it's not just about fishing light, it's not just about fishing accurate, it's not just about fishing with your float dotted down, it's not just about having a multitude of lines that you can swap to. It's about putting them all together, and trust me, if you do, it'll make a big difference to your fishing.